Welcome to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we are tackling a massive, honestly mind-bending question. How can we, as humans, possibly comprehend the Creator? We're going to dive deep into the concept of the Esma-ul Husna, or the divine names, and we'll unpack how they really aren't just vocabulary words to memorize, but rather the ultimate lens for viewing our entire existence.
Okay, right off the bat, I want you to completely rethink how you view these divine names. Don't think of them as a static list. Instead, picture a ladder. The source gives us this beautiful metaphor of a sky ladder, explicitly extended downward, to bridge the immense gap between our limited human intellect, what it calls the earth of our minds, and the absolute divine throne. It's an active tool. It's literally there to elevate our comprehension towards something infinitely greater than ourselves.
And well, that brings us to the ultimate paradox of this whole explainer. Think about it for a second. We are fundamentally restricted, right? By time, by space, by our own biology. So how can a completely limited, finite being ever hope to accurately speak about or even conceptualize a limitless, infinite creator? Where do we even start to find the right words? Section 1. The purpose of the divine names. Let's look at exactly why they exist. Imagine the Esma-ul Husna, kind of like a giant cosmic prism. You know how raw, invisible light hits a glass prism and just explodes into that visible spectrum of colors? It's exactly like that. In this framework, life itself, all of creation, everything in existence, is nothing but the diverse, colorful reflections of God's names passing through this prism. Without it, the light of the Creator would just be entirely invisible and totally incomprehensible to our human minds. Now, the source points out that there are essentially three legitimate paths to actually build a connection with the divine. You can perform righteous deeds, or you can seek out living, righteous people for guidance, kind of like how historical figures sought out prophets and their companions. But truly understanding the Esma-ul Husna, that is the primary key. It's the ultimate method, because grasping these names means you're unlocking the very secret and source code of life itself. Section 2. Limited human versus limitless creator. Let's confront the vast contrast between who we are and who the creator is. Notice the stark contrast here. On one side, we have muqayyad. That's us, the limited, bound human. On the other, mutlaq, the absolute, limitless God. The crucial point here is that a finite, bounded human intellect simply cannot invent names for an infinite, absolute God out of thin air. We just don't have the hardware for it. If we try to slap labels on the infinite using our severely restricted minds, we'll inevitably fall into massive error and distort the truth. Because of those severe limits, there are actually strict prerequisites for even daring to speak about God. You need knowledge, you need guidance, and you need an illuminating book. I mean, think of it this way. Parents wouldn't dream of naming a newborn baby without careful thought, consultation, and agreement, right? It's a huge responsibility. Well, if we are that careful with a human child, we absolutely cannot just arbitrarily name God. We have to rely entirely on the structured knowledge provided by divine revelation. Section 3. Hearts trembling in awe. There is this absolutely fascinating concept here called titremek. It translates to trembling or quaking. The idea is that when the divine name is truly mentioned, a conscious heart should experience a literal internal earthquake. And what's really interesting is that this physical trembling of awe is framed as a prerequisite. It makes a pretty bold claim. If you don't feel this internal shake when engaging with the divine, you don't actually comprehend the magnitude of what you're saying. Your mind just hasn't grasped the absolute. And look, this isn't just some abstract, poetic feeling. It's an incredibly powerful fuel. It is exactly this overwhelming psychological awe that empowered historical and prophetic figures to execute tasks that seemed, frankly, completely impossible and highly irrational. How else do you explain Noah calmly building a giant ark on dry land while everyone mocks him? Or Abraham willingly facing the fire? Or Moses, a former prince turned shepherd, stepping right up to challenge the greatest empire of his time? That supreme internal awe simply overrode standard human fear. We can actually see this emotional pendulum perfectly through Prophet Muhammad's own documented vulnerability. During an incredibly difficult moment, his prayer fluctuates wildly in just a matter of seconds. It swings from this very human, despairing plea of, "Who have you left me to? Have you handed me over to my enemies?" right over to an absolute anchoring realization. If you are not angry with me, I don't care about any of this suffering. I seek refuge in your eternal light. It perfectly shows how understanding the divine names anchors the human heart during extreme emotional turbulence.
Section 4, the danger of innovation and ignorance.
So what happens without that grounding knowledge? Well, we fall into the absolute worst trap, Suzan, or negative assumption. When we don't truly understand the vastness of the Creator, our default human reaction to any hardship is to just blame God. We demand answers for our suffering, and we complain bitterly about what we lack, whether that's health, wealth, or status. And we do all this without ever realizing that our breathing, our minds, our very existence are entirely free gifts that we never paid for. This breakdown directly compares authentic, revelation-anchored remembrance with historical, corrupted rituals, and honestly, the difference is night and day. True remembrance is supposed to actively expand your intellect and sharpen your awareness. It literally helps you view the world clearer through God's light. On the flip side, corrupted practices driven by pure human invention often rely on sensory overload or, historically, even drugs. Think of groups like the medieval Hashishin, who use narcotics to induce a false, numbed-out spiritual high, completely losing the sharp intellectual essence of the message. And this exact ignorance is what breeds idolatry. Get this, even the famous physical idols of ancient Mecca weren't just given random names. They were tragic, twisted spin-offs of God's actual absolute names. Lat was a corruption of Allah, Uzza was twisted from Al-Aziz, the mighty, and Manat was derived from Al-Manan, the giver of all good. By losing that pure knowledge, humanity basically took their own distorted misunderstandings and physically carved them into stone.
Section 5, the linguistic DNA of a believer. Let's look at how this grand theology filters down into daily life. Here is an absolutely vital distinction from the source. The divine texts and the names are delivered for the benefit of humanity, meaning, yes, the human is the subject, but an authentic, properly aligned life must orbit entirely around the Creator. The human is the focus, for sure, but God has to remain the absolute center of gravity for the human's internal and external world. And because God is at the center, a believer literally cannot express the core experiences of life without invoking the divine names. It just becomes their everyday linguistic DNA. You witness something profoundly beautiful, you say mashallah. You hope for a future outcome, you say inshallah. You initiate a task with bismillah. You seek emergency refuge with hasbunallah. And you process absolute grief and loss with inna lillah. This divine vocabulary is completely interwoven into their joy, their desire, their actions, and their tragedies.
So I want to leave you with this incredibly powerful thought from today's explainer to chew on. We've seen how the divine names provide the ultimate lens for everything, from feeling profound awe to processing everyday grief. So if you remove that absolute center from a person's worldview, without that sky ladder bridging our finite minds to the infinite, how do we make sense of anything at all? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive today, and keep climbing that ladder of understanding.